Hello, I'm Mr. Tom, and my mission is to take you deep into the heart of terror. Get ready to dive into frightening stories like never before. Put on your headphones and feel the true fear creeping closer as every word echoes in the darkness, making you question what's real. Are you ready for this journey into pure horror? Imagine being in a quiet house, taking care of children peacefully sleeping, when suddenly the atmosphere starts to change. The silence becomes heavy, air feels different, and what once felt familiar now seems threatening. It's in the shadows of the night where true horrors hide. In these stories, every whisper, every step, and every heartbeat conceals a dark secret. You are about to enter the grim world of babysitters who lived through the most terrifying nightmares of their lives. Welcome to 6 creepy babysitting horror stories. Story 1. The Night Visitor. It was one of those calm nights babysitters love. The children went to bed early, and the house was silent, except for the soft sound of the wind outside. The young babysitter sitting on the living room couch was relaxing, watching a movie. The lights were dim, and the house felt like a peaceful sanctuary. However, around midnight, something shattered that calm. Suddenly, she heard a faint creak from upstairs. The kids must be moving in their beds, she thought. But the sounds continued, growing louder and clearer. Footsteps, not the light steps of children. They were heavy, dragging, as if someone much larger was walking. Her heart began to race. Could the kids be playing? She wondered, but her unease grew. Grabbing her phone, she slowly climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, except for a faint light coming from the children's room. She gently pushed open the door, and there they were, fast asleep. The silence was absolute. Relieved, the babysitter smiled, but as she turned to leave the room, she heard the footsteps again. This time faster, as if running toward her. Her skin crawled. She rushed out to the hallway, looking in all directions. No one. But before she could catch her breath, she felt a cold touch on the back of her neck. Desperately turning, there was no one there. She ran down the stairs in a panic, and the sound of footsteps followed her. She bolted out of the house, and looking up at the second-floor window, she saw the curtain moving by itself. Someone or something was inside, and it wasn't alone. It was a night of pure horror. She couldn't leave the children alone, but couldn't stand the thought of staying there. What were those sounds? Was it a prank by the parents to avoid paying her? Confused and scared, she decided to wake the kids, not wanting to face the unknown alone. But this was the worst idea she could have had. The children couldn't hear or see anything strange, but now they were in the hands of the unknown. Around 3:30 a.m., parents returned from a work party. The babysitter ran out of the house without even worrying about her pay. She just wanted to escape the terror. She never returned to that house again. Story 2. Whispering Doll. From the moment she entered that house, the babysitter noticed something strange. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the walls were trapped in time. There was a collection of old dolls scattered around the living room, porcelain faces and glass eyes that seemed to follow every move. But one, in particular, caught her attention. A doll sitting on a chair near the fireplace, wearing a yellow lace dress and curly hair. The babysitter felt an instant discomfort but ignored it. The children loved that doll, calling her Larissa. The night seemed peaceful until around 11 p.m., when the youngest girl entered the room holding the doll and whispered, "Clarissa is sad. She wants to talk to you." The babysitter laughed, thinking it was just the girl's imagination. "Okay, so what does she want to say?" she joked, picking up the doll. However, as soon as she held the toy, a chill ran down her spine. The doll felt strangely heavy. She put it back on the couch and suggested the children go to bed. Minutes later, while finishing cleaning the kitchen, she heard something. A whisper came from upstairs. Her heart almost stopped. Climbing the stairs cautiously, she found the children sleeping deeply. The whisper continued. Came from the hallway. The sound was clear, almost human. Suddenly, she heard someone call her name. "Come play with me." It was a child's voice, but different. More hoarse, colder. She looked toward the end of the hallway, and there was the doll, sitting on the floor, staring at her with those glassy eyes. How did it get there? The doll had never left the couch. Terrified, she picked up the doll and locked it in the children's room closet. She thought that would solve it. But later that night she heard a strange noise. When she opened the closet door, the doll was standing, staring at her again with a macabre smile that hadn't been there before. Horrified, the young babysitter didn't know what was happening or what to do. She had heard stories of cursed dolls from horror movies, so she had the brilliant idea of throwing the doll into the fireplace. She watched as the doll burned slowly, seeming like a normal toy being destroyed. She still couldn't sleep. Laughter and children's voices echoed in her mind, too quiet to understand. Terrifying. The next morning, she quickly said goodbye to the kids. One of them said, "Larissa still wants to play with you." She forced a smile, never wanted to hear about that doll again. Later that day, she returned home and felt an inexplicable dread. The doll was sitting on her sofa, perfect and alive. No matter how many times she got rid of it, the doll always came back. After endless nights of terror, she had an unusual idea. She decided to have tea with Clarissa. After that day, the doll disappeared and her life went back to normal, or at least less terrifying than before. Story 3. The photo in the window. It was a rainy night, kind where the wind seems to sing old stories through the cracks in the windows. The babysitter, a 19-year-old girl, was comfortably sitting on the couch while the children slept in the next room. She loved these peaceful nights, far from the hustle of the world, till her phone buzzed. An unidentified message. When she opened it, her body froze. It was a photo of a window that looked oddly familiar. She zoomed in on the image, and the shock hit her. It was the living room window where she was sitting at that very moment. Someone was outside, watching. Panic started to rise. With trembling hands, she looked at the window. There was no one there. The rain blurred the view outside, making everything worse. Where did that photo come from? Grabbing her phone again, she decided to call the children's mother. But before she could dial, another message came through. Another photo. This time, it wasn't just the window. It was her, sitting on the couch, taken from somewhere very close. Desperation took over. She locked all the doors and hid in the children's room, trying to calm them. But the photos kept coming, one after another, all showing her and the children from different angles. The last photo showed something that made her scream. A hooded man standing at the bedroom door, his face shrouded in shadow. But when she looked, she saw nothing. Nobody. Panicked, she tried to call the children's parents, only to realize she had no signal. Yet, the photos kept coming supernaturally. That night was pure psychological terror. The next morning she tried showing the parents the photos, warning them about someone watching the house, something supernatural. There were no photos, no evidence, only she knew what had happened that night. The babysitter was never the same, forever terrified by the unknown. Story 4. The Locked Room. Every house has its secrets, and the one where the babysitter was hired was no exception. At the end of a long hallway, there was a room that always remained locked. The children didn't talk much about it, and the parents had made it clear, you don't need to worry about that room. Curiosity had always been the babysitter's weakness. And that night, after the children were already asleep, she found an old key in a kitchen drawer. Her mind began to fill with questions. What was so important about that room that no one could see? With light steps, almost as if she feared being caught, the babysitter walked down the dark hallway. The key fit perfectly in the lock, and with a long, loud creak, the door opened. The smell of mold and dust filled the air. Something else hit her, a deep, cold chill. Turning on the light, the babysitter was confronted with a terrifying sight. The room was a kind of shrine, with old photos of children scattered on the walls. But the worst was a large chair in the center, with straps on the arms and legs, as if someone had been tied there. Suddenly, the door slammed violently behind her. The babysitter ran to leave, but couldn't open it. The cold increased, and whispers began to fill the room, like the voices of children who were no longer there. She looked at the photos and saw that the eyes of the children in the images were focused on her. They seemed alive. Many questions raced through her mind, and she ran downstairs to call the police. She needed to report something very bizarre. Something strange had happened in that room, and she didn't know what. Maybe the children were being kept there until they were ready for a dark ritual. The police arrived quickly, but they seemed unconcerned about what she had said. They were strange and doubted everything she said. They repeatedly told her not to tell anyone what she had seen. Forget it. She grew more nervous and tried to scream for the neighbors to hear, terrified, until she felt a hand on her shoulder and realized she had been asleep the whole time. It was just a nightmare. But when the child woke her, they repeated the same words as the police in her dream. Confused and afraid, she decided never to return to that house again. For years, she had the same dream repeatedly. She had created a bizarre connection with something dark in that house, but she never dared to dig deeper into it. Story 5. The Voice in the Nursery. It was almost midnight, and the house was in absolute silence. Babysitter, sitting in an armchair in the living room, was nearly dozing off when she heard a strange sound. Something that sounded like a voice, but low, almost imperceptible. She hesitated for a moment, thinking it was her imagination. The night had been peaceful. The children were asleep in the nursery, and nothing unusual had happened, until now. The sound came again, but this time it was clearer. A child's voice whispered something unintelligible. She stood up, her heart racing, and went upstairs to the children's room. As she approached the nursery door, babysitter stopped. A voice was clearly coming from inside, but something was wrong. It was as if a child was speaking, but the tone was wrong, old, empty. She carefully opened the door and looked inside. Children were deeply asleep, each in their crib. The moonlight dimly illuminated the room, casting shadows on the walls. But the voice, she could still hear it. It was a soft whisper that filled the air, coming directly from the youngest child's crib. The babysitter approached, trying to understand what was happening. The little girl was lying on her side, but her body seemed rigid. Cautiously, the babysitter turned her over, and what she saw made her recoil in horror. The girl's face was pale, her eyes were open but lifeless, and from her mouth came the voice. But it wasn't her voice. It was something older, darker. The child began to move strangely, almost as if being controlled. The voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come." The babysitter froze, but before she could back away, the girl's small hands grabbed her wrist with unnatural strength, and the voice concluded, "Now you're ours." She quickly placed the child back in the crib, terrified. What was that? What had happened to the child? She didn't have the answers. Quickly calling the children's parents, she didn't know how to explain what had just happened, and said goodbye, leaving in a hurry. She thought that the farther she was from that place, the better. But that wasn't the plan the unknown had for her. Years passed, and everything seemed peaceful. She got married and started a beautiful family, until one night, she heard a voice coming from her daughter's room, who was just a few months old, like the child she had babysat years ago. Entering the room, she felt a familiar atmosphere, and as she looked into the crib, she witnessed the most horrifying scene, as if she were reliving that night from years ago. From the baby's mouth came cold words that said, "I warned you that you would be ours." After that night, she lost her mind, had to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. She told the same story repeatedly, but no one believed the horror she had lived through. Until one night, during a full moon, she took her own life in her hospital room. She couldn't survive that nightmare any longer. Which of these stories gave you chills? Leave your comment and share your own terrifying moments with us. Story 6. The Midnight Game. The night was perfect for a session of scary stories. Two children loved horror, and the babysitter, who always enjoyed sparking their imaginations, suggested something different. A game she had learned online called the Midnight Game. According to legend, it summoned spirits that wandered through the house. The children, curious and excited, insisted on trying it. The babysitter hesitated for a moment, but eventually agreed, thinking it would just be a harmless game. When the clock struck midnight, they followed the instructions to the letter. They lit a candle for each person, wrote their full names on pieces of paper, and with a drop of blood from each, began the ritual. The candles flickered faintly in the darkness as the babysitter started to feel a strange presence. The air in the room seemed heavier, and the children, who had been smiling before, began to feel uneasy. Suddenly, all the candles went out at once. The room was plunged into complete darkness. The babysitter, trying to stay calm, relit her candle, but the children's candles wouldn't light again. Something was wrong, very wrong. A low sound like dragging footsteps echoed through the halls. The children clung to the babysitter, terrified. As the sound grew closer, she tried to light another candle, but it seemed impossible. Then a shadow passed by the living room door, but when she looked, no one was there. Children began to cry, and the babysitter realized this was no longer a game. Suddenly, a tall figure, shrouded in darkness, appeared in the hallway, its eyes glowing red. The presence was so intense that it was hard to breathe. With a twisted smile, the figure whispered, "The midnight game has begun. You cannot escape." Time seemed to freeze. Babysitter and the children ran out of the room, but every time they entered another, the figure was already there, waiting for them. There was no escape. In the end, the babysitter realized that the game wasn't just a game, it was a sentence. The midnight game never ends, it only starts again, and in that house, they played forever. They never found peace again. Every night at midnight, the game restarted. A game of fear, terror, and guilt. Priests, religious figures, and occultists were called to end the game once and for all. But a blood pact only ends with death, and the game wouldn't have a happy ending as they hoped. If you made it this far without looking over your shoulder or feeling a chill down your spine, congratulations. But be careful, the darkest stories are yet to come. So, if you enjoy venturing into the unknown and want to hear more spine-chilling stories like these, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to never miss a new episode of terror. The darkness has many more secrets to reveal. Are you ready for the next one?